Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2025 Hot Topics in Environmental Law Summer Lecture Series. I'm Mark James, the Interim Director of the Institute for Energy and the Environment and an Associate Professor of Law here at Vermont Law and Graduate School. I am filling in for your regular host, Kristen, Faculty Director of the Environmental Law Center and Associate Dean for Environmental and Experiential Programs here at Vermont Law Graduate School. Professor Kristen is off at a conference today. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. Each talk for each talk you are eligible for one Vermont or CLE. So please keep records of which talks you have attended. We will be taking questions at the end of the presentation by Professor Cha, so please put those into, if you're watching on YouTube, you can put those into the chat box and enter them in at any time, and we will collect them and answer as many of them as we can. With that, I'm incredibly pleased to welcome Professor Mijin Cha to the Hot Topics lecture. Professor Cha is here serving as our distinguished energy scholar. She'll be here on campus with us for this week and for next week. Professor Cha is an associate professor in the Environmental Studies Department at the University of California, Santa Cruz, an affiliate faculty in the Legal Studies Department, and on the faculty advisory board at the UCSC Center for Labor and Community. Professor Cha is also a fellow at Cornell University's Climate Jobs Institute, an academic fellow with the Climate and Community Institute. And she received her LLM and PhD from the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London. Her writing and research focus on climate and environmental justice and the just transition, how to transition to a carbon-free economy in a way that protects workers and communities, advances labor and climate coalitions, and addresses the relationship between inequality and the climate crisis. She has served on the board of Greenpeace USA Fund and is an emeritus board member of the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment. She has widely published, but also has drawn upon considerable experience working in the nonprofit sector prior to entering into academia, and draws connections to her current work through the work of mentors such as Luke Cole, the Center for Poverty Resource and the Environment, and as well as Dr. Manuel Pastor, who's at the University of Southern California. She previously worked as an associate professor at Occidental College, an adjunct professor at Fordham University School of Law, and at various policy and think tank organizations. She is the author of A Just Transition for All, which was published in 2024, which discusses the 4 pillars plus of how to advance a just transition that engages and elevates communities as we move towards a fossil fuel-free world. We are delighted to have her here with us. Today, she will be presenting A Just Transition for Whom? Understanding the opportunities and limitations of a just energy transition. Please join me in welcoming Professor Mijin Cha.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to you and the Vermont Law School for hosting me this summer. I'm thrilled to be here. As mentioned, my name is Mijin Cha. I'm an assistant professor at UC Santa Cruz, and I just want to make sure that you can see my PowerPoint screen. Do you see my PowerPoint? I'm hoping. Well, maybe I'll just proceed as if you can see my screen. Let me just make sure that it's going. Okay, so here we go. Today I'm going to talk about some work that I have done over the past few years, and that is the basis for my book, Just Transition for All. And happy to answer any questions at the end, and looking forward to discussion. So just in brief overview, I'm going to start by just talking about what is just transition, As Mark mentioned, I have a governance framework in my book called The Four Plus Pillars of Just Transition. And wondering, I think it's on the top of all of our minds now of what can we, if anything, can we do in this moment. So let's start with some context setting about where we are in this moment. So we know that we need rapid emissions reductions to stave off the worst impact of the climate crisis, but these patterns of inequality, inequity that I've seen cannot be replicated in decarbonization. And what I mean by that is that we know that we have to reduce greenhouse gases rapidly to make sure that we limit warming as much as possible. But while we are doing so, we cannot increase or continue inequity that we are seeing currently in our fossil fuel economy. There's currently a false dichotomy between jobs and the environment that hinders environmental and climate policy. And I'll talk about this a little bit in a few slides, but basically, the corporations and firms have done a really good job of making it seem like environmentalists and workers don't have the same uh, goals when in fact are at odds with each other. When we know the truth is that there's much more that brings workers and environmentalists together than separates them. As we can see from the last election and from the last few years, that inequality and social disconnect is increasing. This is important because as we think about something like just transition, or we think about something like climate policy, we need to bring as many people along as possible. Otherwise, we risk increasing social disconnect and increasing societal unrest. And finally, fossil fuels must be drawn down, but ignoring socioeconomic conditions will hinder the energy transition while increasing tension. So basically, where we are in the moment is that we have the significant challenge of future climate disruption that could, in fact, make the world more unjust than it currently is. We know we have to end fossil fuels, but we are in this conundrum where what can we do? Where can it be done? And what exactly will things look like as we start to think about moving away from fossil fuels? And what we really need to think about is how can we break this zero-sum decision making, where instead of jobs or the environment, we move the dominant paradigm of or to a dominant paradigm of and. So thinking about jobs and the environment, climate action and increasing societal well-being. So I think this then raises the question, why does transition have to be just, right? Like perhaps many climate people can agree that we need a transition away from fossil fuels, but why it has to be just, I think, is not as clear. But the truth is that we have a history of unjust transition. And what I mean by this is that, the fossil fuel and the energy transition is not the first transition in the industrial transition. And in some senses, industrial transitions make sense, right? Like as economies mature, you move away from previous industries into new industries. And transition in and of itself is not necessarily unjust. But our inability to support workers and communities through these transitions is what makes transition unjust. So if we think about, for instance, historical transitions like deindustrialization and globalization, they caused great damage to local economies across the country. And the scale of the fossil fuel transition is magnitudes greater than deindustrialization and globalization. So if we replicate those patterns of an unjust transition, right, it's completely incompatible with stable economies. If we understand contestation, the role of identity and the opportunity for social acceptance, what I mean by this is that a lot of climate policy and energy transition and energy discussions can really be too overly technical and too overly scientific. And they kind of ignore the role that identity and social acceptance plays in fossil fuel communities. And therefore, understanding what those identities are and the opportunities for social acceptance are can actually help accelerate an energy transition. I think this often gets weaponized to say that we should care about coal communities in a way of delaying action. But what I mean by this instead is that instead of going into a community and just starting by demonizing the fossil fuel industry, if we understand the history of the fossil fuel industry in the community, how people there actually view the fossil fuel industry, it's a much better way and much more effective way for us to organize against the fossil fuel industry. More inclusive, more just policy expands political coalitions and builds power to overcome fossil fuel opposition. So I think again, this speaks to some of what I see as a lacking in the more mainstream climate discussions is that the equity and inclusion can often see as hindrances. But in fact, the more inclusive a policy is, the more effective it is. There's a paper by an economist at UMass Amherst called Michael Ash that raises the question, is environmental justice good for white people? And what he found was that when we actually focus on environmental justice, we have more pollution reduction overall because environmental justice communities are where pollution is the most concentrated. So if you reduce pollution in the areas that are most concentrated, you have much greater overall pollution reduction. Also, understanding what people's concerns are and where inequities arise helps build power to overcome fossil fuel opposition. We have to remember that the energy transition is largely political. And what I mean by that is that we have a lot of technical expertise and knowledge about actually how to transition away from fossil fuels. What is the most prohibitive factor is political. So if we build so we need to build mass coalitions and mass public power to overcome fossil fuel opposition. And we do that through having more inclusive and more just policy. And finally, as I mentioned in the last slide, there's just a need for more just societies. Excuse me. If the fossil fuel transition is unjust, we will just see societal disruption on a level that is greater than we have seen before. So I think this necessarily then raises the question of what do we mean by just? Who decides and defines what justice is? Is it the workers? Is it the communities? Is it local? Is it on a regional scale? Is it on a global scale? Is it decision makers? These questions are really trying to understand who gets to decide what is a just transition. I think it also raises questions of what time frame are we thinking about when we think about just transition? Is it just in the aftermath of closing one plant, for instance, or is it a long-term 10, 20-year look at a region to see how that transition has occurred? And what do we do with competing visions? I think this is something that's very important and very challenging about just transition, which is that not everybody will agree. And what may be just to one person may be unjust to another person. And how do we deal with these competing visions? How can we think about ways to advance policy or what policy can be created to really think about how to address competing visions of justice? So when I think about just transition, excuse me, I really think about the work of Tony Mazzocchi, who is pictured here. A lot of my students make fun of his fashion, but we have to remember he is of his time, which was the 70s and 80s. And Tony Mazzocchi was the head of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers Union, which has now been merged into the U.S. Steelworkers. And Mazzocchi was truly visionary in the way that he thought about some of these issues because he represented workers that worked in toxic industries. And what he said was that, for instance, the first environment is the workplace, right? Like instead of saying jobs versus the environment, or there's the environment that is only nature, a workplace is inherently an environmental issue. If we think about the toxins that workers are exposed to, excuse me, if we think about all of the environmental considerations in a workplace is an environmental issue. And he also made the argument that there are some industries that are too toxic for society to continue, which I just want to underscore how transformative of a vision that is, because that meant that basically he was arguing for the elimination of industries in which his workers were employed. But Mazzocchi argued that there were some industries that societally were too damaging. And so as we transition away from them, it shouldn't be the workers in those industries and the communities that depend upon the economic activity of those industries that bear the burden of transition. So he argued for this thing called the Superfund for Workers, which was based on the US Superfund program. And basically was that employers in these industries should set aside funds to help workers and communities as they transition away. I think in the modern day, what we could argue is that fossil fuels are now too toxic for society to continue. But again, as we move away from them, right, it should not be the workers and communities that are dependent upon these industries that bear the brunt of this transition. So what is just transition? As I just mentioned, the origins are with the labor leader Tony Mazzocchi, which is how many people conceive of it. But it's also important to remember that Mazzocchi worked very closely alongside environmental justice leaders, and together they came up with this idea of just transition, or the Superfund for Workers and Communities. So in short, it is understanding and addressing the negative economic and social impacts to industrial transitions. But it's very important to remember that this is a transformative and ambitious idea, not just business as usual. And I think it's important to really keep hold of that idea that just transition is in and of itself transformative and ambitious, because as just transition has become more popularized, there's an increasing risk of co-opting and greenwashing. And what I mean by that, for instance, is that there are organizations and advocacy groups that argue, for instance, any kind of generation of renewable energy is a just transition. But of course, that's not true, right? and a just transition is much more than a fuel source replacement. And what I mean by that is that if all the systems remain the same, but what we do is we swap out renewable energy for fossil energy, we actually will not meet our climate targets, and also we will not meet our equity targets. So just transition is a transformative and ambitious idea that goes beyond just thinking the system is fine and we just need some tweaks. It is extremely ambitious, and if you hear anything about just transition that is anything less than something that is somewhat transformative, you should be concerned that there's some co-opting and greenwashing happening. So this is kind of how the scholarly work around just transition has arisen. But of course, that what it means to people on the ground is something very different. And so this quote that I'm about to read is from a research project that I did with one of my mentors, Manuel Pastor, that looked at what just transition meant to people in fossil fuel states and in extractive states, and what they needed for a just transition. And the reason why we did this research was that uh, to read what we call ground truthing, which is, taking these concepts that arise in the academy and seeing what the reality is on the ground. There very often is a disconnect between what is happening among scholars and then what is actually people are actually experiencing on the ground. So, for instance, this is a quote from an organizer we interviewed in Eastern Kentucky. And they say, quote, I could go out to the street or I could go to Walmart. I could stop 25 people. Excuse me. None of them would know what just transition means. You stop anybody and ask them what war on coal means, they know that. It's like, man, progressives tend to hide what they're doing and then create a language that's only for the elite. And I think that's what we've done. Everybody goes through a transition, right? You're getting a divorce, it's a transition. You lose your job, it's a transition. We know this terminology. The whole idea of a just transition, meaning fair, more equitable, thoughtful, green, none of that really resonates. And so it's basically a language made up for elites, by elites, to keep regular people out of the debate. Excuse me. And what I think is important about this is there are three things that I think are really important about this quote. One, it points out, right, that just and transition mean very different things to different people. So you can't just go into a community and start talking about just transition and assume that people understand that you mean one, even an energy transition, right? And two, let alone what is just. The second thing is how effective that messaging is on the other side, right? So war on coal, for instance, if we contrast that with just transition, what is the action? There's a war, right? On who? Coal, right? Extremely clear, extremely simple, extremely straightforward. Just transition does not talk about what is the action, right? Who are the people doing it? Who are the people who are benefiting from it? There's no consideration in the term itself of what is really being advocated for. But the third thing that I think that is really important about this quote is that while it is in opposition to just transition as terminology without organizing or anything behind it, it is not in fact an opposition to an energy transition, right? So they're saying that you can't just come in here and start talking about just transition and think that people know what you mean, but they're also not saying that people love coal and want to stay with coal for forever, right? And I think this is really important as we think about the organizing that needs to be done to bring people on board with just transition, is that if you talk to folks in coal regions, the situation is much more complicated than gets reflected in mainstream media, right? Like most miners that I've spoken to don't want their children or grandchildren to be coal miners, right? But if you start going in and start demonizing the coal industry without creating relationships where they can trust what you're saying and think that you have the same shared understanding and shared vision for the future, you're really not going to get anywhere. Like you cannot go into a coal community and start talking about just transition and assume that people will come on board. But again, that doesn't mean that they cannot be organized. It just is a question of what is effective and what really do we mean by this terminology. So to dive more into it, as Mark mentioned, my book, A Just Transition for All: Workers and Communities for a Carbon-Free Future, was published by MIT Press in December of 2024. It's a culmination of research that I've done over the last 4 to 5 years in fossil fuel regions with fossil fuel communities, really thinking about what is the idea of just transition and what would it actually need to entail for us to actually have some kind of have a transition that is just. So there are many definitions of just transition, and I think that in building off of the previous slides, we may not all have the same definition of just transition, but in my book, I argue that there are two requirements of a just transition. So the first is that there has to be a transition away from fossil fuels. And what we see now actually is that while we are generating record levels of renewable energy, we are also not transitioning away from fossil fuels. So, as I mentioned, the trend for renewable energy is increasing globally, which is great, right? Objectively, this is a good thing. We are producing more and more renewable energy across the globe. Even in the US, we see that we are increasingly generating more wind and more utility scale solar. With the current administration and its attacks, unclear how this will change, but a lot of projects are already underway, meaning that that ship has sailed. So we do anticipate that renewable energy generation will continue to increase at least for the next couple of years. But at the same time, we also see increasing production of fossil fuels. So this graph, as you can see, tracks gas, coal, and oil production globally. There's slight dips whenever there are financial recessions, like in 2008, and also, of course, the COVID pandemic. But the trend is clear, right? The trend is increasing production over time. This is also true in the US, that crude oil and dry natural gas are increasing production. I want to point out also that we see that there's a huge increase in between 2010 and 2012, which is when President Obama lifted the ban on exports of oil and gas. And so when we think about the impact some of that policies have on fossil fuel production, right? Like some of this stuff actually is bipartisan. So when President Obama lifted the ban on oil and gas exports, then those exports truly, you see this huge increase in oil and gas production. And of course, now we see a huge amount of production of LNG. Again, LNG exports began around 2017. And we expect this trend to continue because there was a lot of support for building LNG export terminals in the IRA. Again, unclear about what will happen to those credits, but given the administration's propensity for loving oil and gas, I imagine that those LNG export terminals will continue. And the issue, of course, is that when we build new fossil fuel infrastructure, we can expect at least 10 to 20 years of continued exports because the capital costs of construction have to be recouped. So in the debate of the IRA, during the IRA, when a lot of environmental justice and climate justice organizations were really against any new fossil fuel infrastructure, there was a lot of tension around this debate, and there was a lot of mainstream climate movements that really were pressuring the EJ and CJ movements to drop this demand. But of course, it's so short-sighted, right? Because as soon as you build any new fossil fuel infrastructure that you build, you can expect and anticipate 10 to 20 years more fossil fuel use. So the more new fossil fuel infrastructure we build, of course, the more fossil fuels we will extract and export. And you see, again, in the US, for the last several years, we have been the top natural gas producer in the world. By a lot, right? If we look at the next closest is Russia. So what this shows is that we are in fact not in an energy transition, but what sociologists like Richard York and Shannon Bell argue is an energy addition, where the renewable energy that we are being produced is on top of, i.e. in addition to fossil fuel produced. We are not displacing any fossil fuel production. This is a little bit of an overstatement, as there are some small cases, like for instance, in California where I live, there are instances where during the day, the solar production is actually displacing natural gas production. But if we think on even on a regional level or national level, global level, right, the trend is very clear, is that we are definitely in an energy addition, which means that we are not actually transitioning away from fossil fuels, right? We are just adding more energy sources, which I think then leads to the argument that shows that you cannot actually rely on a market-based transition. Because of what you hear from a lot of renewable energy advocates is that renewable energy costs are falling, and that eventually they will be so cheap that they will overcome fossil fuels, right? And they will crowd out fossil fuels. But as I mentioned earlier, right, is that there are all these costs that you don't see that go beyond just the cost per kilowatt of production. And so you cannot rely on market-based solutions, and you cannot rely on the renewable energy market being strong enough to actually displace fossil fuels. We need proactive mandatory fossil fuel drawdown. But of course, not all fuels are the same. And as we know, there's a difference for coal in the US. And as you can see, since about 2008, there has been a steady decline in coal. What is happening, of course, is that maybe we are definitely decreasing coal mining, but we are not actually supporting any of the miners or coal communities as as the coal industry declines. Um, and we expect this decline in coal production to continue, despite, again, the administration's claim that they want to revive coal. The first Trump 1.0, sorry, tried to revive the coal industry and failed because the demand for coal is just decreasing. This may change, I think, depending what happens globally. I think the other unknown here is data centers and AI, which, as we all know, have a tremendous environmental impact, and we are actually seeing coal-fired power plants that were closed being reopened to fuel data centers. And so I think this also put a pin in to maybe talk about later is really thinking about part of the problem with just thinking about energy transition as a market-based and not political issue is that a lot of climate folks just say it doesn't matter how much energy we use as long as it's renewable. And I would argue that, in fact, data centers are a good example of how they will actually we have to think about where energy use is going and how much energy is being used. Otherwise, the energy transition will actually be hindered. But I think it's really important to point out also that while fossil fuel production has increased, jobs in the fossil fuel industry have declined. Again, we see a peak around 2015, but a steady decline since then, and that's largely due to automation. And as you can see, there are only about 45,000 coal miners and less than 150,000 workers in oil and gas. So the fossil fuel industry often touts itself as a huge job creator, but the numbers are just don't really back that up. And that's, again, largely due to automation. But I want to note, though, that even though there aren't as many jobs in total, they often have an outsized effect because those jobs often exist in rural areas where they are not only the only employer, but also very often, if there are other employers, the best employer. Fossil fuel jobs tend to have higher rates of unionization. They tend to pay more than other jobs, and they tend to be the only industry in these regions. And I just want to note here that that's often very deliberate, that the fossil fuel industry has done a lot of lobbying at the state level to exclude other industries so that communities become monodependent on the fossil fuel industry, which means that any transition away from it is extremely devastating. And so while the number of fossil fuel jobs are maybe not as high, for instance, before the recent attack on the federal government employed like 2 or 3 times the amount of people than the fossil fuel industry. But because of where they're located, they often have an outsized impact. And this is further exacerbated in the coal industry. As you can see, the majority of coal is produced in the West, but the majority of the coal jobs are in the East. And that's because Western coal, which is the Powder River Basin, all of those big coal deposits out west, that is almost largely automated because it's surface mining, which is much easier to do. The picture that I started my presentation with is from the Powder River Basin. And you can see the coal is just is just below the surface. Eastern mining is still a lot of underground mining, so it's more labor intensive. So I would say, I point this out to say the coal industry makes a lot of money from Western coal mining, but it doesn't provide that many jobs. But also when we think about just transition policies that only focus on jobs and workers, it leaves many communities under-supported. So we have the situation here where we're not really transitioning away from fossil fuels. We are somewhat transitioning away from coal, but in a way that is unjust. Workers and communities are not really seeing the benefits of the fossil fuel industry and fossil fuel activity. And we can no longer really rely on these market dynamics to create an energy transition, that we actually have to have proactive fossil fuel drawdown. So I think then, the case for a transition away from fossil fuels, I think is clear, that we need a transition, not an addition. But I think then it leads to the second argument, which is that transition must be just, which is a more complicated issue, right? I think that there is not one prescriptive answer, and what I mean by that is that there is not like a just transition will look like X, and justice will look different in different places. So for instance, what is a just transition in Kentucky will necessarily be different than what is a just transition in California, for a lot of reasons, right? Like what other resources and what other industries can be attracted to this region? What are the conditions that the societies are facing? But I think that there are principles that we can follow that are mandatory for our transition to be just. So fundamental to understanding what makes transition just is understanding what is causing the issue. And I think that there are folks in the climate movement that think that climate change is caused by fossil fuel emissions. So if you get rid of fossil fuel emissions and you can keep everything else the same, and you will address the climate crisis. This is the guiding philosophy for a lot of policies, for instance, that only think about EV replacement for ICE replacement, rather than thinking about, okay, how can we reduce the number of cars in general, and then the remaining cars that we have to have, how can those be electric, right? They're two very different governing philosophies. Um, and then there are others like myself who think that climate change is the natural result of extractive systems and institutions. So in some sense, climate change is just a symptom of a deeper problem. And as such, without systemic and institutional change, you won't actually address the climate crisis. And so this book is a book by the Japanese philosopher Koi Saito, which talks about Marx's view of the environment and the Anthropocene. And what Saito basically says is that the same systems that cause the problem cannot be relied upon to solve the problem. So for instance, if like myself, you argue that capitalism is causing the climate crisis, that you cannot rely on capitalism, green or otherwise, to solve the problem that capitalism has caused, which then requires systemic and institutional change. So the difference here is really, do you think that we need just like everything is basically fine, we just need some tweaks to the system, or that the system itself is causing the problem, so there needs to be systematic and institutional transformation? So if we think about this idea of just transition, my colleague Dimitris Divis and his colleague Roman Felli put together this kind of idea of how do we think about just transition in terms of it won't look the same in every place, but we can think about, who gets covered, who gets a say, who is at the table. And so Stevens and Felli talk about this kind of idea. We could think about it as on through issues of scale and scope. So for instance, if we think about a narrow scale, it's just coal miners, right? So we think about just coal miners and one coal mine. So narrow scale, narrow scope. If we broaden the scope, then we think about just transition for all fossil fuel workers in a city. So if we think about just a very narrow, very specific, narrow in scope just transition plan, would only think about coal miners and one coal mine. If we wanted to keep the scale narrow, so we think about just fossil fuel workers, but we want to broaden out the scope, right? That would be fossil fuel workers in a city. So you're expanding the scope, but still keeping the scale pretty narrow. A broad scope but narrow scale would then just be just transition for all miners across the world. So still only focusing on just transition for miners, but you're thinking now just rather than just one mine, you're thinking about the entire world. And then a broad scale and a broad scope would be just transition for all workers and all communities, right? So if we think about, again, the idea that just transition is transformative, just transition can take place, we could think of it as an iterative process. So it could start with just on a narrow scale, narrow scope, so just for coal miners and one coal mine. But eventually, we want to get to the broad scale, broad scope, which is just transition for all fossil fuel workers and all communities. And so I think this schematic is very helpful for thinking about what we think about when we think about an expansive and transformative change from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. So this graphic is from an organization based in Oakland called the Movement Generation. And on the left, you see an extractive economy, right? Which at the center and what drives the economy is work and exploitation. So resources are extracted to the maximum capacity to feed into as much work as possible, which then results in an enclosure and consolidation of wealth and power. So the worldview is one of consumerism and a colonial mindset, and the governance structure is militarism. So consumerism and colonialism and militarism are necessary to continue this economy that is based on work and exploitation, that is fed in through overexploitation of resources, so that the purpose being then, of course, the concentration of wealth and power. But if we think about where we want to go, this extractive economy is where we are currently at, but we want to move to an economy that is regenerative. So you see here the difference is that the purpose of work is not exploitation, but is actually cooperation. So that allows for a regenerative use of resources, with the purpose being then moving from consolidation of wealth and power to ecological and social well-being. And then caring and sacredness is the worldview that supports this purpose. And then the governance structure is deep democracy. So when I think about addressing the climate crisis and moving away from systems of extraction, right? We're thinking about moving away from the graphic on the right to the graphic on the left to the graphic on the right. So we're replacing the purpose of consolidating wealth and power to advancing ecological and social well-being, right? This is at the heart of what makes transition just. Are you moving away from systems that just consolidate and power and wealth for the few to a system that really centers and focuses on ecological and social well-being for all? And I think moving from systems of extraction to regeneration also requires us to expand what we think of as climate solutions and climate considerations. So if we think here that we need to move from consolidating wealth and power to ecological and social well-being, what does that actually look like? And so this is another quote from an interview that we did during the project that argues that a social safety net actually advances an energy transition. And so what they say is, quote, well, I tend to think first about the energy sector, but it is clearly not, we're not just thinking about the energy sector, right? And so over the last 5 years, what I have learned is that the single most important just transition policy that has actually improved the quality of life for Kentuckians has been the Affordable Care Act, without a doubt. This advocate obviously was one from Kentucky. And I think this is really important to highlight, again, that we need to be thinking more broadly when we think about what is a climate policy. So they are arguing that a social safety net is a climate issue. And how is it a climate issue? Well, why the Affordable Care Act is important is because if it's the first time that if you lose a job, your health insurance is not necessarily tied to your employer. So if you think about it, if you're losing your fossil fuel job, you have to be concerned about what implications that has, which means that if there is no transition support, it increases opposition to an energy transition, right? But things like the Affordable Care Act, a strong safety net, if every job is a good job, we have to worry less about what people are leaving and what they're entering into, because the conditions, the broad societal conditions, are in general strong and safe, right? So for instance, if we think about the case of Germany, which has a region that moved away from steel manufacturing and coal mining, what they found, they did actually, in fact, lose a generation of workers, meaning that they were not able to place them into new jobs. But because their safety net is strong, they didn't go into the same economic disparity that workers in the US would come into. So while it may seem as if it's not related to the climate crisis, economic and social considerations are, in fact, fundamentally climate considerations. And so I think the case for just transition is clear, but then it can be challenging to think about. We can think about all these theoretical issues, but if we think about what we actually need to do, how do we move from theory to practice? And this is some research that Manuel and I did that came up with this idea of 4 pillars. It was a community engaged research project that looked at environmental justice communities in California, and what they came to us and asked what would be our proactive vision for a just transition. It was funded by the 11th Hour Project, and we did a combination of semi-structured interviews, original data analysis, and case study analysis. And so what we came up for was these 4 pillars of just transition, which is on the bottom. And then as I was writing my book, I realized that there was more that was needed. And so I'll get to that in a minute. But basically, what we did was when we looked at transition cases across the country and across the globe, we were looking for things that were kind of commonalities, like what helped people transition in a way that was as just as possible. I should note also that one of the challenges is that because we are at the beginning of discussions about a fossil fuel transition, often people ask, like, what is an example of a just transition? And we just have not had that many just transitions. But we have had transitions that have been less unjust than others. And so looking to see what was necessary, we came up with the first pillar being strong governmental support. And I'll note here that we don't mean this in a way to have complete confidence in the state. As we can see now, the state is often the perpetrator of injustice. But if we think about the choice between a private-driven transition and a public-driven transition, the chance for a just transition is just much greater in the public sector. Economic diversification gets to what I was talking about earlier about how a lot of these communities are monodependent, which leaves them extremely vulnerable to any kind of industrial transition. So the more community, the more businesses, and the more economic activity there is, the stronger communities are. And also to note here that sometimes this can be thought of as just replacing one big anchor institution with another. So replacing the fossil fuel industry with, say, big box stores. But there was some work done by the the Colorado's Office of Just Transition that showed that when they surveyed folks that lived in coal regions, that they actually don't want big box employers, right? They want thriving local economies that have many different businesses that are owned by people who live in community, right? So really thinking about what is economic diversification is important for just transition. Dedicated funding streams is something that is difficult to create, but that is really fundamental to a just transition. So, like for instance, in the Trade Adjustment Act, which was the transition program that arose in response to globalization and deindustrialization, one of the challenges was that because it was based upon congressional appropriation, you had a lot of funding for the program when Democrats were in office and not very much funding when Republicans were in office. But the problem is that when you're trying to retrain for a job, you can't just start and stop that retraining, right? The TAA was too limited in scope, but one of the things that hindered it was that it was never properly resourced. So dedicated funding streams are extremely important, particularly if we think that these regions will need 10 to 20 years of continuous support for them to really have new economies that thrive to replace the fossil fuel industry. And then strong and diverse coalitions, which I'll talk about in depth much more in a couple of slides. But those were our original 4 pillars that we came up with. But while I was writing my book, I realized that the 4 pillars were a necessary but not sufficient condition to advance a just transition. So you could see how you could have all of these things, strong governmental support and so forth, and still maintain existing systems and not have the transformative change that is needed. And we're trying to avoid this checklist justice idea, which is, sometimes energy justice and environmental justice advocates can sound like they're just trying to check off boxes of, do we have procedural justice? Do we have distributive justice? Do we have recognition justice? Which are all, of course, important, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee a just outcome. And so reading a lot from abolition scholars and labor scholars, this idea of non-reformist reforms is now what I call the 4+ pillars for a just transition, which is that you need the 4 pillars, but you also need to ensure that the policy that you're advancing is a non-reformist reform. And a non-reformist reform basically is the idea that you work within the system to create new and alternatives to the existing system as you're drawing down the extractive system. So you're operating within the system as it exists now, but with the intent to move past the existing systems. So what this looks like, for instance, in the abolitionist community is that there are in fact no good prisons, right? You cannot reform a prison to make it just. And so the policy-wise, what it would look like would be you would take, for instance, money from a police budget to build supportive housing. So you are, on the one hand, reducing the funding and resources for an extremely abusive and extractive entity and building new accountability forms in the meantime. So taking money from the police budget to build supportive housing and other accountability measures, winding down one system while you're building up another. And the way that I think about how this happens, and with my colleague Emily Grubert in the energy world, is through public ownership. So this is the title of some work that we've done looking specifically at the Powder River Basin and how public ownership would happen if we were to take control of the remaining coal in the Powder River Basin. The argument for this is because as long as the transition is profit driven, we can never have a managed transition, which means basically we need to think about what we need for the next 10 to 20 years as we draw down fossil fuels in a way that is managed and controlled. The only way to do that is through public ownership because we have to remove the profit motive for fossil fuel extraction. Also, if we have public ownership of fossil fuel, both coal here, starting with coal, but fossil fuel resources generally, we can do more large-scale long-term planning. Right now, it's quite atomized, where wells closed and open, and it's very uncoordinated. But if we think about what we need for an energy transition, we need long-term, large-scale planning. And that can really only happen in the public sector. And the final point is that we need to bring public back into the ownership of government and public goods, right? Currently, what we're seeing is that the public resources are being pilfered for private profit. But these are public resources. And so, for instance, while we need to still use coal because we know we won't end fossil fuel use tomorrow, those benefits should come back to the public, right? For too long, public resources have been only for private profits. And so we need to bring the public back into the ownership of government and public goods. So I think then this, of course, raises the question of like, what can we actually do in this political moment? And I think also, given that we are currently seeing the state being weaponized for some truly horrific things, do we even want to think about the state? But I think that this is now our moment actually for us to do really important things that will set the foundation for a much bigger, more transformative future. So what we need is all of the above, but for progressive change. So all of the above tends to be the term that many people use for we need all energy sources, but we don't. We just need the renewable ones. But what can we do to advance progressive change? So the first thing that we need to do in this moment is really look to local, regional, and state level. There are lots of great things that are happening on the local, regional, and state level. And before the IRA, which was the biggest influx of resources into climate action, states, the local, regional, and state level was already doing climate action, right? So they were already far ahead of the federal government, and those governance levels still need to be supported. For instance, there's an organization called the National Climate Jobs Resource Center. They organize labor unions at the state level to advance climate action at the state level. So that kind of work will still continue and must be supportive. There's also a lot of defensive work that needs to be done on the local, regional, and state level. I'm thinking about protecting migrants and other social justice considerations that need to be done at a more localized level, that are things that we can do now to actually build power and build organizing and do the organizing that we need to press for bigger change in the future. And specific to the climate movement, we need to expand out from overly scientific and technical focused policies. For instance, in this moment now where there is great injustices occurring, talking about degrees Celsius, which again, for a country that is on the Fahrenheit scale, is somewhat limited in its ability to be successful. But like folks are being disappeared and sent into black holes, and then to talk about like climate policy only in terms of megawatts or greenhouse gas emissions, a million metric tons carbon dioxide, makes the climate movement sound extremely tone deaf, right? And it alienates people from the movement, which leads to the last point, which is that the climate movement must be a social justice movement. I think there are some folks that think that equity considerations and other social justice considerations are outside the scope of climate change. And I argue that they are actually at the center of the climate movement and center of climate change. The climate movement in and of itself is too small and too narrow to actually create any kind of meaningful change. It must expand out, but not only that from a political perspective, but from a reality perspective, every issue is a climate issue, right? And the more that we can hammer home that every issue is a climate issue, the bigger the climate movement can grow, and the more people that will see themselves as climate activists and not just, thinking about other socioeconomic considerations. So the last point that I'll say, and then I'm excited for Q&A, is that the last pillar of the strong and diverse coalitions and why they're important. So I really love this graphic because I think it shows really what is possible. So of course, big fish, just a few small fish, the big fish is going to win. But the more small fish we have, right, then in fact we can win. And I think we have proof of this concept in the win of Zoran Mandami in New York City. And I think a lot of people try to dismiss it by saying it's New York City, it can't be replicated. But I think that is really shortchanges what happens. If you look at the issues that he ran on, there are issues that affect everybody, right? Affordable housing, affordable living, childcare cost, transit issues. These are issues that resonate with people across the country. But more than that is also the way that he won, right? He did true grassroots organizing. He mobilized disaffected workers. He moved disaffected voters. He moved voters from Trump to Mamdani, right? That this is the small fish coming together to eat the big fish. He did all that in the face of millions and millions and tens of millions of dollars being spent against him, right? And so I think actually that win can be replicated in many places by understanding that these grounding principles of organizing the many to defeat the few is actually how we win. And so the last quote that I'll end with is exactly this issue. This is a quote from an organizer that we talked to in Louisiana who was trying to build this vision called the Green New Deal for the Gulf Coast. And so the idea was that power is more than just a policy win. I think too often movements really narrowly focus on a specific piece of legislation or a specific policy. But what this organizer says is, quote, "My definition of a win now is watching power be built, being able to see power built. For the first time, 100 groups plus across 5 states said, I'm going to be in charge of my destiny. I'm going to put down what I want to see. I'm not going to wait for somebody to give it to me. We're going to declare what we want and we're going to move it together. And that is power building. We're building a movement. We're not building a piece of policy." And so I think, as we think about what we can do in this moment, it is really this, right? We're trying to build a strong movement so that we can overcome the current administration and build a more just future. It's not just thinking about what is we can do in the next 2 years, but really what is that proactive vision that we can tell people that will make their lives better for the next 10 to 20, 30, 40 years. So thank you, everyone. That was a lot of information, I realized, but I'm excited to hear questions.
Thank you, Professor Cha. That was an amazing presentation. I'm so glad I got a chance to see that. We do have a few minutes left. We have until 1 o'clock Eastern time to take questions from our audience. So if you do have questions, you can enter them into the chat space on YouTube, and we will get through as many of them as possible. So as the moderator, I'm going to reserve and ask for the first question. I think it builds off of something that you had talked about towards the end, and we've heard an awful lot. There's been an awful lot of discussion about the abundance movement, especially with the book that's come out from Ezra Klein and Derek Thomson, and how that has been interpreted. We just simply, there are too many hurdles, too many obstacles, and we need to remove some of those procedural steps so that we can simply build stuff faster. If you have a comment or on how that idea fits in with what is necessary to support communities in a just transition.
I think the abundance movement is there are some good ideas there, right? We definitely need to build more housing, we need to build more transit, but so I think the problem that they identified, I agree with. Their solution, I really disagree with. And the idea that we just need to deregulate in this moment when there is mass deregulation happening, I just think is really misguided. We talked about this briefly, but one of the barriers to building things is not, in fact, too many regulations, but understaffing of offices, of administrative offices where permits, for instance, are processed. The abundance agenda doesn't really talk about that. It doesn't really talk about corporate control and corporate power and how actually the fossil fuel industry is funding a lot of this opposition so that they can actually stop renewable energy projects from going forward. It doesn't actually also address that this consideration of like, are we just making the same mistakes as the fossil fuel economy? So for instance, should we really just build solar wherever we want? I don't think so. There are still sensitive environments that are extremely important for biodiversity, and that should be taken into consideration. Also, their vision that they have at the beginning, where some drone delivers your prescription to you, I just think is so dystopic. Like, what happens to people who actually do this work? And so, they've kind of co-opted abundance from other more leftist progressive movements, which actually argue that abundance is an abundance of care, abundance of healthcare, like of wellness, right? That's really the abundance agenda that we want, that everybody have the conditions that they need to thrive. The existing abundance agenda is just neoliberalism in a better package, with a better, more slicker podcast. But I would just be very wary also of the people that are backing it, which is the crypto industry and the AI industry, and would maybe argue, do you think that we have the same interests at heart?
Thank you. We're going to do a little bit of a deeper dive and build off this idea of a place-centered transition, which I know is sort of is core to the idea of a just transition. And I'm wondering if you could sort of talk about how that fits into. You had the example from Eastern Kentucky and full communities and how to address their specific needs, but how does a place-centered transition really focus in on the community itself and how to build up from that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think fundamentally, just transition must be place-based, right? Because, for instance, we have to create jobs where they're being lost. And there is some economists that argue that we don't have to worry about geography so much, that we just have to create jobs and then people will move to them. And in our research with the Just Transition Listening Project, which looked at kind of 100 people who had experienced transition, we found that that's actually not true. That in fact, there are a lot of reasons why people stay where they stay. And if you don't create jobs where jobs are being lost, people just become more poor. There are also a lot of landscape issues that are very place-based. So, for instance, another reason why we have to move past this idea of extractive systems is that many former coal mine and coal mining regions in Appalachia are becoming prisons. So we're moving from a fossil fuel economy into a prison industrial complex. So we have to really think about what's happening in place and also the organizing that has to happen to build power to help overcome the opposition of the fossil fuel industry is by nature place-based, right? You need to talk to people where they're at and where they're living and build power from the ground up. So just transition must foundationally be place-based.
Thank you on that. And I thought it was a really interesting concept for the question about the super fund for workers idea, which evolved out of that uh, unions and then bringing forth knowing an understanding of the potential harms that were being inflicted upon those activities too. But how does that, core of, what a just transitions history is, how does that change as we think about it in a broader way? And, are there specific actions or things that should be taken for engagement, for supporting communities, mechanisms that could be put in place to support communities that go beyond, the workers who are directly affected by the loss of employment opportunities, but the community as a whole, that are impacted either directly or indirectly by a transition from fossil fuel based economy into something that is different.
Yeah, also a great question. And I think this speaks to the need for a climate policy to include socioeconomic considerations, right? So part of what we need to do right now is what my colleague Lara Skinner at the Climate Jobs Institute calls proof of concept, right? We have to show that the low carbon future can be one that is just. So not just incentivize people to create good jobs, but mandate that renewable energy construction, for instance, pays living wages. And I think when you can show that the what we're transitioning into can give people the same, if not better, economic security, you have much more of a starting point to talk from. And so rather than just asking people to take this leap of faith into a future that is unknown, particularly given our history of unjust transition, we really need to think about ensuring that the green future and that the carbon-free future is just. And so I think, expanding out from just workers, as you point out, that a lot of communities, they will lose a lot of money that is really relevant and that is needed for things like schools and roads. But I also think that we really don't have a shortage of resources. We just have a shortage of priorities. And so, for instance, using the Superfund concept, fossil fuel industries and like many of the polluter pays efforts should be paying now while they're making money into a fund that can be used for things like tax-based replacement, that can be used for things like supporting housing for workers that are being displaced. Those kind of things can all be paid for by the fossil fuel industry.
Thank you. And I'm going to put in for one more question, which you had sort of brought up at the end. If we are in a longer term trajectory, 10, 20, 30 years, that there will be periods of advancement and there will be periods of, yeah, moving backwards or backsliding. I think might agree that we're in a period in this last couple of weeks where we have seen, gains that have been turned back. So what sort of things help, prevent that sort of, build for a longer term engagement and ensure that gains that are secured at a very often very hard fought, are preserved, or that at least are very difficult to dislodge? What can local, regional, state level do to ensure, governments do, or even communities do, to ensure that they are able to preserve things that they have made gain progressive advancements that have happened?
Well, I think what's happening now is a really great example of why the transition is political, right? Because even if we have laws on the books, if you have a regime in place and the supporting actors to just ignore it, then you don't really have a rule of law. And so I think rather than thinking about how can we kind of shore up the laws that are on the books, I think it speaks to the need for a continuous political organizing, right? Like if we think, for instance, one of the ways that President Obama came into office in 2008 was his Organizing for America, right, where he did 50 state plan. And unfortunately, that was then dismantled after the election. But if that had stayed in place, we would just have continuous engagement, right, continuous organizing, and you continuously build a base of voters that are always engaged politically rather than being engaged every 4 years. And so I think what the current moment shows us is that we really have a political challenge that cannot necessarily be solved with the right piece of legislation, considering that if you have someone in office that doesn't really even care about the rule of law. So we really need to think about these things as political issues and challenges.
Well, thank you very much. We are out of time. I need to wrap up. I want to thank Professor Cha for her presentation today and thank everyone for joining us. Our next talk will take place online Tuesday next week. We'll hear from Professor Madison Condon from Boston University. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everyone.